Any comments, questions?
So hot.
Yeah, okay. So I'd like to take 3 at once. Is there anybody else who'd like to? Or is this the only 1, 2? Anybody else? 3. Okay, so if you start. Do you want to go to... Oh, sorry. Okay.
Okay, first of all, thank you for what has been quite an enlightening kind of introduction to narratives. And as a researcher kind of using narratives, I'm kind of finding that what on face value appears to be a relatively straightforward method is anything but. And that's the wonder of it, really, that it opens up so many questions. But I've got a question that kind of branches out a bit just from one directly about narratives, and that is, to what extent should kind of narrative researchers actually consider, analyse and report on aspects of kind of paralanguage and visual indicators that obviously coexist with, in particular, oral narratives. And I was thinking that in terms of Julia's presentation, and indeed in Molly's, you had quite a difference between, in one aspect, somebody who was very articulate, or evidently articulate in talking about their narratives, and in Julia's, the 82-year-old kind of Irish grandfather who appeared not to be overly articulate in trying to express some of the stories, whether by intent or willingness or ability or whatever. And yet, sorry, it's a rather long presentation, I will end it very quickly. In both of the recounts and the transcripts you used, there were kind of references to some paralinguistics, and so on. And there's a wealth of information in paralinguistics and kind of visual indicators, and I'm quite interested in the degree to which narrative researchers should pay credence to those and report on those as well as the actual narrative itself.
Thank you. Okay. Yeah.
I was just wondering, I think it was during Molly's talk about political narratives and about the questions of who tells these stories and who doesn't actually tell stories. So about this whole thing about narratives which are actually silent in a way, and I guess that there are narratives which are not expressed, or at least expressed differently from more canonical ones probably. And I was just wondering if there is a way about it, because I would think it's quite interesting to kind of catch these narratives, and if there is a way to investigate about these silent ones actually.
Okay, thank you. And yeah.
I just have a question to Julia Brannan, and it's about contextualization. You kind of skipped a bit this part because you were running out of time, but I wonder if you could just say a bit more about this, so very interested in that.
Okay. Could I invite the panel to say anything on any of those questions, or all of them, as they wish? Yeah? In any order that you wish. I mean, feel free, or I shall pick on you.
I'm happy to go. We can just go around. Should we do that?
Okay.
So the first question on paralanguage. I think for me, really a critical question is, what is it that you think you're doing in the in the narrative interview or whatever it is? How is it that you regard the transcript as an object, right? What is it that you're trying to reproduce? I mean, and I think that for me, those kind of questions are prior, because that will actually lead you in a direction of telling you at what level should you actually, do you count every second? Do you do every false start? I think that my own sense about that is that inevitably the transcript is a different kind of product than it is not a speech event. And so even if you do it absolutely, literally every single thing, you still will not have, you're only representing that moment. And so it's really up to you in terms of what it is that you're trying to get out of that. But I think there is a false level of confidence that if only I do it exactly, I actually then take the photograph of that moment and we have it. So that's the thing that I would question there. And I think that, people like Mike Frisch have written pretty interestingly, really in defense of cleaning up transcripts, because I know there's a lot of arguments of why we should represent every false start and on the button. But Mike argues pretty convincingly, I think, again, this is from the perspective of oral history, but saying really what you want to do is to get inside that interview and represent the feeling of it, okay? And if that's what you're doing and you already accept that that's a huge interpretive leap and that what you're doing in the end is always representation, it gives you a little bit of more artistic freedom as well, because you have to own your own position there, okay? So that's what I would say, number one. The question about silent narratives, who does and doesn't speak, I think that that's a very important question. Of course, the problem is how do you co-analyze the things which aren't said? And here I would say it's one important to think about the relationship between told and untold stories, and not think of those as constant categories, but as things which are told and untold sometimes to some people in some situations and at some moments. Still, if we're going to hold on to the idea that some stories really don't see the light of day or don't in particular settings, while acknowledging that that's important, I would also be very cautious about not over-interpreting that. There's nothing that I feel more allergic to analytically than somebody giving a long exegesis on the meaning of what wasn't said. So that's, and I don't have so much on the third one, so I'll talk on that.
Okay, Julia.
Well, the first point, I thought it was important that I put in the ers and ahs for the beginning of the way he responded to the invitation to tell his story. Although he doesn't tell a story, I would argue that there is, in a way, he does throughout the interview through careful probing. But also we have the great advantage that we also interviewed his son, who also, often it was the next generation who told the stories about how tough life was for their parents. This is quite interesting in the sense that some stories of children of migrants don't, but we came across quite a lot of the second generation talking about the hardship of the first generation and what it was like. And certainly we came across, in terms of your second question again, about the stories untold, there were people who didn't, grandfather generation, the people who came over in the 50s, who said they didn't want to take part because they didn't want to go back and revisit the past. Yeah, that's a kind of answer to the second. And to the third, on contextualization, well, I don't want to go into a great deal of detail there, but there's a paper which I could alert you to, the person who raised that. But looking at different layers of kind of context in the sense of and how you might bring these to bear. So in a design of a study, you might be looking at ways in which you would bring in those different levels of context. So, and also, thinking about and asking people to, on panels, who are not familiar with the context. So in a transnational study, we could pass bits of transcript over to another team from another country, and they'd ask very important questions about this, which for us, as people who took a lot of things as given, would kind of tease out, what is, education system different, what are the policies in other countries, what does it mean what do words mean, and so forth. So, I think you have to kind of come up in context with kind of stranger's eyes, really, which I call the sociological imagination.
Thank you. It would be nice, Maria, to do it for the visual and to answer those and the written.
Well, referring to the first question, I think we have to be clear about where this question comes from, and for me it comes either from an epistemological tradition of realism, so I have to transcribe everything so I can have a sort of reflection of what really went on, But the other field where it's coming very much is, of course, conversational discourse analysis and sociolinguistics. And people who are more interested, or ethnomethodology, where people are more interested in how these interactions occur and how meaning emerges through these interactions, rather than really the story, the narrative. So for me, I wouldn't say do it or not do it, but be clear why you want it to be there and what you're trying to achieve with this. And then, if you are a narrative researcher, for me, just adding the O's and A's is not enough at all. There is so much going on in terms of what we say embodied narrative and bodily response to narrative. So you have to go much deeper if you want to do it. But be clear. I mean, not do it just because it's there and it's an option. It's an epistemological option and a disciplinary option, as I say. From my area, which is usually working with the archive, I always go with Pierre Nora's famous archive, as much as you like. Something will be left out always. So this also goes to the silence thing, that it's impossible to transcribe or to record all stories or to rewrite all stories. And I keep telling this to people who come with this important question. But what I also say, but you know something, guys, stories are all we have. So we have to work with this. These are traces of how we are humans and how we communicate with others. And let's try and work with them. Of course, acknowledging when we have, big noisy silences, as they call them, we have to acknowledge them, but we can't really interpret them or recover them for this matter. And this also, I think, has a bit responded to the idea of contextualization. Again, you can go on contextualizing forever, but I call it here the researcher's cut. You have to have the researcher's cut. This is my context because these are the questions I have raised. These are some of my hypotheses. This is what I wanted to say or not. So it's good to know that even when you contextualize, you're actually editing something. And in this case, your context as well.
Okay, Corinne.
Well, I think the question about paralanguage has probably been addressed pretty much fully. I think it just has to relate to what level one's decided to analyze at, but also that a lot of times people use elements of paralanguage, I think, in transcription without really knowing against what they're relating them to. So they have pauses, exhaustively measured without really any sense of what the kinds of conventions of pausing in that kind of talk or in that kind of language community are, and assuming that they kind of transfer, which is not always the case. But then there are some very directed examples of people using instances of paralanguage. For instance, Lars Christer Huden's work on stories about pain, where he looks at the physicalization of pain in gesture in people's stories, and that just seems to me really directed and careful work that gets to lots of areas of his respondents' stories that otherwise wouldn't have been addressed. And then on the silent narratives thing, well, I think I think it's quite important not to have too clear idea about what is a good story or what is a story, and also to look maybe at the kinds of processes, the narrative processes that can surround research. So some research that I was involved with somebody else at the Centre for Narrative Research, Chugan Essen, we were looking at the way that the young people, particularly involved with the research, who were talking about themselves, but often not that extensively, were involved with the research through the processes of participating in the research, being in the interview situation, responding to the interviews later. So there was a kind of activity, a kind of a kind of activity narrative around the process of the research that we looked at also, to kind of extend what they were not saying. Contextualisation, yeah, contextualisation is a very good thing. I'm always affected here because I work in the HIV field by this. There used to be a big slogan by the of the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, which was called ACT UP in the 80s, which was no representation without context.
Okay. Well, I certainly have found this really illuminating, and I've learned things from the 4 speakers. I think it's been really fascinating, a really, really interesting seminar. Before I ask you to thank the speakers, I'll just tell you a little bit about some other things that we're doing in Novella that you might want to sign up for. We have a session, a workshop on narrative ethics, which Maria Medved, who's here, and Jens Brockmeyer are leading, and that is March 19th, so it's very soon. And that touches on some of the issues that have been raised this afternoon. We've also got a visual narratives workshop, followed by a public lecture by Wendy Luttrell, who's coming over from New York, and that's in April. And we also have Mark Freeman coming over, who's going to do a workshop on othering and a public lecture as well. And that's also in April. No, it's in May. May the 24th, I think it is. Is that right?
6.
It's in May on one of those.
It's the last Monday in May.
Thank you. The last Monday in May. And for any of those things, you can sign up on the IOE store, so the Institute of Education store it's called, or the National Centre for Research Methods website. We also have a doctoral student seminar series with the Centre for Narrative Research, which happens here and happens about once every month. And you can find that on the CNR website or the National Centre for Research Methods website as well. And there's a postgraduate conference coming up too. Corinne, do you want to say when that is?
Is it April the 28th?
No, it's the 25th.
It's
So
on
Wendy
the
Luttrell is April 24th, and to think
You're
of
right.
experiment is the 25th.
That's right, the next
that's
day.
a free
Fantastic.
Yes,
and to people who are presenting, I think you can still register to present if you're a graduate student, actually.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
And can I just add one
Yeah,
other
of
thing?
course.
Because next week we have Maria Medved also speaking at the Centre for Narrative Research on her wonderful narrative research with Aboriginal women in Canada. So that is March 13th at 12 o'clock.
Wonderful. Okay. So lots of things going on, and do keep an eye because we'll have other things as well. Could we please thank the 4 speakers? I think you'll agree it's been a really rich event.